Good morning and welcome to Thursday morning. And it is June the 24th on this Thursday morning. And we're going through Paul through the phases here, through the steps. He addressed Ephesian elders on Sunday. On Monday, he was in Jerusalem. On Tuesday, he was Paul the prisoner. On Wednesday, he was Paul the defendant. And today, on this Thursday, he is Paul the witness. Paul the witness. The suggested reading is Acts chapter 26, verses 12 through 13. The lead-in verse is chapter 6 or verse 16 from that passage. Acts 26:16. Paul is saying, "I have appeared to you." Actually, he's giving his testimony, and he's repeating the words that Jesus said to him on that road to Damascus. "I have appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and as a witness." And that's verse 16 of Acts 26. Again, suggested reading is Acts 26, verses 12 through 23. Luke's purpose in describing the three court scenes was not just apologetic. Doesn't mean he was making apologies. That is also a term used for defending of the faith. It was evangelistic as well. During his 2 years of imprisonment, which had interrupted his missionary career, Paul must have felt very frustrated. But when opportunities for witness were given him, he seized them with confidence and courage. The main examples Luke gives are his private interview with Felix and his public confrontation with Agrippa. Felix has been described as one of the worst of Roman officials. He was well known for his cruelty, lust, and greed. He seems to have had no moral scruples. But Paul was not afraid of him, since he spoke to him about righteousness, self-control, and future judgment. Chapter 24, verse 25, it is reasonable to suppose that he rebuked the procurator for his sins. He also spoke to him of faith in Jesus. As for the trial before Agrippa, Paul was not overawed by the show of pomp and power that marked that occasion, or by the assembly of notable personages in court. "See what an audience is gathered together for Paul," exclaimed Chrysostom. He was one of the early church fathers. But Paul made no attempt to ingratiate himself with the authorities. He wanted the king's conversion, not his favor. Wow, that's a powerful line, is it not? He wanted his conversion, not his favor. For Paul, the most important thing was that his man had a soul that needed to be saved. 3 times Luke has Paul repeating the elements of the gospel in the king's hearing. In chapter 26, our suggested reading today, verse 18, verse 20, and verse 23, those elements of the gospel are shared. Each time Paul thus repeated the gospel in court, he was in fact deliberately preaching it to the court. Festus might call him mad, but Paul knew that he was speaking the sober truth, and that's verse 25 from the Revised Standard Version. Thank God for Paul's courage. Thank God for Paul's courage. Kings and queens, governors and generals did not daunt him. Jesus had warned his disciples that they would be, quote, brought before kings and governors, unquote, on account of his name, and had promised that on such occasions he would give them, quote, words and wisdom. And that's from Luke 21, verses 12 and 15. Jesus had also told Ananias, who had presumably passed the information on, that Paul was, quote, his chosen instrument to carry his name. To carry his name, quote, before the Gentiles and their kings and before the people of Israel, and that's in Acts 9:15. These predictions had come true, and Paul had not failed. Paul is challenging to us in these instances where he's on trial. This is a serious situation. This isn't just sharing Christ with a neighbor. So often when we talk about witnessing, we talk about evangelism, the reason that's given most often for why people don't do it is fear. Fear of how they'll be perceived, fear of how people will respond. But here's Paul, fully knowing that these men to whom he speaks can take his life with a word, and yet he shares the gospel, proclaims the gospel, tells his own testimony about how he was confronted on that road and what the voice said and what his calling now was to declare the gospel, yes, even in front of kings and magistrates. And so he does. And so he does. Eventually, it will lead to his death, just as it will lead to the death of every one of the remaining disciples after Judas has hung himself. Except John, he will live the longest. They will attempt to take his life, but will fail. They will have him in prison on the Isle of Patmos for years, but that won't stop him either. It is challenging to me. I hope it's challenging to you too in a good way. That if God was faithful to those men and the women of the early church, he will be faithful to us too if we will not be ashamed of his name. He will give us the courage and the strength we need and the help of the Holy Spirit to bring to our memory those things we have learned and heard. Share Christ, no matter the circumstance, no matter what fear may strike your heart, share Christ. Blessings to you today.